do ba 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 do.
Right folks, so this is the second video in my little mini video series where I start talking about suspension. Now, the reason I'm doing this is because suspension is something that I'm playing around with at the moment because I've recently bought this bike. So while I'm doing it, I thought I'd make a little video series just to try to help people out, because suspension can seem like a bit of a dark art. And what I would highly recommend, folks, if you don't understand what sag and preload mean, then go and watch my first video, which is on my channel, Suspension Basics, Sag and Preload. You need to understand what those mean, because that's what we're going to be playing with in this video. We're going to be making some adjustments to the preload, and we're going to be measuring how much sag is currently on the bike. But it's important that you know that, and I've mentioned this in the first video, if you don't set your bike up for you, it doesn't matter if you've had your bike a day or 5 years. If you've never done this, it will transform how the bike feels, and it will also make it safer. So let's get into it. We're going to talk about measuring sag and setting preload to achieve the right amount of sag. Obviously I'm using my GSXR750. Your bike might be slightly different, the adjustments might be slightly different, the location of the adjusters might be slightly different. So yeah, just be familiar with your bike and apply the same principles that I'm going to use to your bike. The first thing we need to measure, folks, is the length of available stanchion that you can see there. So we're going to measure from the bottom of the fork stanchion, I'll zoom in a second, to the dust seal. But what's important about this first measurement is that the front wheel needs to be off the ground, and the suspension needs to be hanging free. So at the moment I've got a headstock paddock stand, so my suspension is hanging free. If your front paddock stand has got the feet on the bottom that support the bottom of your forks, that's no good, because that's going to put some compression into the forks. The other way of doing this, if you haven't got a headstock paddock stand, is putting the bike on the side stand, getting a friend to tilt it towards them while you put your foot behind the side stand. Not everybody likes doing this, however, and tilting it till the front wheel comes off the ground. Or get an ABBA stand or some other type of stand, but the front wheel needs to be off the ground and the suspension needs to be hanging free, not under any pressure. So I'm just going to zoom in and show you the measuring points a little bit closer. We're going to measure from the bottom of the fork stanchion to the dust seal, and that, once you've measured that, you're going to mark that as L1. That's your first measurement, L1, and however many millimeters that is. Okay, so now we've got our L1 measurement, we need to take our L2 measurement, and the way we do that is you need to be sat on the bike in all your riding gear, with both feet on the pegs and the bike upright. So you might want to do this next to a wall or something so you can balance. And once you're sat on the bike in that riding position, both wheels on the ground, feet on the pegs, then you get your friend to just very simply lift the front of the bike slightly to extend the suspension, and then let it settle. Simple as that. Lift it slightly, let it settle, and you then measure exactly the same 2 points again, and then you record that measurement as L2. Okay, so to get your L3 measurement, same as before, sit on the bike, all your riding gear,
let it go, can't hold it back anymore,
etc, etc. This time you get your friend to compress front of the bike and then let it settle, and you then measure the same 2 points again. That is your L3 measurement. Okay, so let's look at the measurements then. So my L1 measurement was 127 millimeters. Remember, this was the front wheel off the ground and no pressure on the forks, measuring the extended length of the fork stanchion. My L2 measurement, with me sat on the bike in all my riding gear, after my friend had lifted the front of the bike and then let it settle, that came out then remeasuring the same points at 89 millimeters. L3 measurement for me was 87. This was again me sat on the bike, but this time, once I'm sat on the bike, my friend compresses the front suspension and then lets it settle again. So that came out at 87. Now those are our three measurements. Now what we need to do with this is we need to measure, we need to add these two numbers together. So for me it came to 176. Then divide that number by 2 and that gave me 88. This number then needs to be subtracted from your L1 number, which then gave me a sag measurement of 39 millimeters. So it maybe looks complicated or sounds complicated, but it's really simple. Once you've done your three measurements, add these two together, divide that number by 2, and then subtract that number from your L1 measurement, and that gives you the amount of sag. Now, if these two measurements are the same, then just use that number. But the reason these are different, and it will be for many bikes, is because there's a natural amount of drag inside the suspension. So the bushings, the seals, etc. will create a little bit of drag. So making these two separate measurements just gives you a more accurate measurement at the end. So mine was 39 millimeters. Let's have a look at what that actually means, or let's discuss what that means and what I'm going to do with that number. Right, so 39 millimeters is a bit too high for me. Now I've already adjusted this, but I'm going to explain the process and why. So for most sports bike, naked bike and adventure bike riders, you probably want to aim between 30 to 40 millimeters for the front sag. Now what I'd recommend is start at 35, so slap bang in the middle of that range, and then you can fine tune it either way by a few millimeters, just to suit your preferences. Most sports bike, or some sports bike riders, prefer a front end biased setting, so more preload on the front, less sag, less preload on the rear with slightly more sag, etc. But you'll find your own preference. But if you start from 35 millimeters front and rear, that gives you a baseline platform that's nice and stable to begin with. Remember, there's more to suspension than just this, but this is your starting point. So in order to reduce sag, because mine is 39 millimeters at the moment, I need to add preload. So to reduce sag, you add preload. If you want to increase sag, so if my sag was 32 and I wanted to increase it to 35, I would reduce preload. The reason reducing preload adds sag and vice versa is because, remember, preload is how much tension you put in the spring. So the more tension in the spring to begin with, it's going to sag less when you get on the bike because it's already tense. If you remove preload, you get on the bike, it's going to sag more because there's going to be less tension in the spring. So one last time, to reduce sag, you add preload, and to add sag, you reduce preload. Let's look at how. Now to add preload, so remember my sag setting was 39 millimeters, so I want to reduce that by 4 millimeters. So to add preload, on my bike I've got these aftermarket preload adjusters. On your bike it might have a hex nut, so you might need a socket. On some bikes, I think on some Kawasaki's, there's like a large flathead on one side and completely different adjustments on the other side. So it can get quite confusing, and this is why you need to become familiar with your bike. So for me, I'm going to turn the preload adjusters clockwise to increase preload, which will then reduce my sag. Nice and simple. Now I've already done it, so I'm not going to mess around with it. And these preload adjusters are really smart, and they allow me to make those adjustments by hand without needing a socket. And let me get that back because I don't want to mess it up. So basically, folks, you're gonna play around with the preload until you get the right measurements. So if you make a change, two really important tips. The first tip is make changes equally on both forks if your bike has a preload adjuster on each fork. Adjust each fork equally, and then remeasure. Make small adjustments and remeasure. Maybe start with half a turn on each side and then remeasure again. If that's not enough, do another half turn on each side, remeasure again. And then keep doing that, keep turning these, adding or reducing preload until you can remeasure to get your desired sag numbers. Now, measuring the rear sag, the principle and the process is exactly the same. It's just the measuring points are different. So remember, to get your L1 measurement, you need the rear wheel off the ground and no pressure on the suspension. Don't do it on a paddock stand. I've got my bike on a paddock stand at the moment, because that paddock stand is supporting the swing arm, which is pivoted, and therefore the suspension is going to be slightly compressed, so it's not going to be an accurate measurement. Do the side stand trick again, or if you've got an ABBA stand, etc. So same as the front, the rear wheel needs to be off the ground and the suspension fully extended. That's your L1 measurement. Then your L2 measurement, same as the front, you sat on the bike, all your riding gear, bike upright, etc, etc, and get your friend to lift the rear of the bike so the suspension extends and let it settle. That's your L2 measurement. Then get your friend to compress the rear of the bike, push it down to compress the suspension, then let it settle. Then measure the same 2 points again, and that's your L3 measurement. Now, the measuring points that you're going to use, certainly that I used anyway, was the bottom of the axle, all the way to a marked point on the fairing, on the rear fairing. So what I did is I used this black line, I put a bit of a black masking tape, and as I say, the bottom of the axle up to that point, and just measure from the same 2 points for each of those 3 measurements. Do the same equation that we did on the board for the front suspension, and you'll have your current sag reading in millimeters. When it comes to adjusting the rear suspension, however, same principle, but the rear suspension obviously looks very different to the front suspension. So let's have a closer look at the rear. Right, so to adjust the preload on the rear, and many bikes will have a rear shock that works similar to this, but some bikes will have different types of adjusters. If you've got a more expensive suspension setup, like an Olin suspension, for example, again, it might look slightly different, and that's why you need to be familiar with your bike. But on this one, you'll see that we can see the spring, and above the spring you've got 2 rings. There's an adjusting ring there, and then above that there's a locking ring. In order to add or remove preload, we need to loosen off the locking ring, and then we need to turn the adjusting ring either clockwise or anti-clockwise. On this bike, as I'm looking down on the top of the shock, clockwise on the bottom ring there will add preload, and anti-clockwise will remove preload. But just bear in mind, some bikes, depending on where the adjuster is and how it's positioned, some bikes it's the opposite of clockwise and anti-clockwise, because you need to look from underneath the bike. But just, this is why, again, I've said it a few times now, just be familiar with your bike. The instructions and the details of your suspension should be in your user manual, so it's a good place to check there. Remember also that once you have adjusted your rear shock, added or removed preload, and you found your desired measurement, don't forget to tighten up the locking ring again. Hopefully that's given you a good understanding of how to check and measure the amount of sag that's on your bike, and then how to adjust your preload in order to get the right sag settings. Remember, maybe use 35mm front and rear as a starting point, and then just go from there. There's so much more to suspension. Remember, we haven't spoken about compression damping, we haven't spoken about rebound damping, high speed compression, low speed compression. There's a lot more to talk about, and there's a lot more to unpack over the next maybe 1 or 2 videos. My aim is that I can make some adjustments and fine-tune my suspension while I'm out riding, so if I can do that, then I'll maybe capture some footage. But if not, I'll do it here with a nice warm cup of coffee next time, because it's bloody freezing. There are experts out there. I'm not an expert, folks, but I'll always try to help you, and I'll always try to share what I know. So feel free to cross-reference what I've just said with an expert. You can do that. You're more than welcome. But if anybody's got any questions, just let me know. I always try and interact with my subscribers and anybody that comments on my videos. So yeah, drop a comment if you found this useful. Let me know. If you have any questions, I'll do my best to answer. But for now, that's part 2 done and dusted. So part 1 was explaining sag and preload. Part 2, how to measure and adjust it. Yeah, look forward to part 3. Remember, if you haven't already, like and subscribe.
Do ba 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 do do ba do.